Volkswagen spent nearly a decade building cars that were programmed to lie to a machine, not to a customer, not to a regulator's face, to a piece of testing equipment. That distinction matters more than it sounds, and by the end of this video you'll understand why it's the most useful part of the whole story. Here's the setup. Volkswagen wanted to sell diesel engines that were clean, powerful, and efficient, all at the same time. That sounds like a normal marketing promise, the kind every car company makes. But engineers inside the company knew something the marketing department either didn't know or didn't want to hear. You cannot actually deliver all three of those properties at once with the technology available to them. Push a diesel engine to be powerful and fuel efficient, and its nitrogen oxide emissions go up. Rein in the nitrogen oxide to meet clean air standards, and you lose power or efficiency, or you need expensive after-treatment hardware that eats into cost and trunk space. It's a triangle. You can have two corners of it comfortably. Reaching for the third corner without giving something up is, with that generation of engine technology, not really possible. That's an engineering constraint. It's boring, it's technical, and in a healthy organization, it's exactly the kind of finding that should travel upward without friction. An engineer says we can hit 2 of the 3 targets, not all 3, and leadership adjusts the plan, the marketing claims, or the targets themselves. That's not what happened at Volkswagen. Instead of surfacing the limit, the company's engineers wrote software to hide it. Let's walk through the mechanism, because it's more elegant and more disturbing than most people realize. The cars weren't just running dirty and hoping nobody would check. They were running 2 different modes. During an emissions test, the software could detect the telltale signs of a testing environment, the pattern of the drive cycle, the position of the steering wheel sitting almost perfectly straight for an extended period, the way the wheels were turning without the vehicle actually going anywhere on the road. Laboratory emissions testing happens on a machine called a dynamometer, essentially a treadmill for cars. And that setup has a very distinctive signature compared to a real commute. The software was built to recognize that signature. The moment it detected a test, it switched the engine into a low emissions calibration, reduced power, different fuel injection timing, full engagement of the emissions control systems specifically so the car would pass. The instant the car went back onto an actual road, it switched back. Regulators would later call this a defeat device, and the name stuck because that's exactly what it was. A piece of software whose entire purpose was to defeat the test it was being given, not to solve the underlying engineering problem. On the open road, in the mode drivers actually experienced every day, the same cars pumped out up to 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxide pollution. Not 40% over, 40 times. That gap is the whole scandal condensed into one number. It tells you the test mode behavior wasn't a rough approximation of real-world performance, with some tolerance for error. It was a completely different car, engineered specifically to exist only in the 15 or 20 minutes it spent on a testing rig. And this ran for nearly a decade before anyone caught it. Think about what that actually requires. It's not one clever hack shipped once. It's a piece of fraud that had to survive multiple model years, multiple engine revisions, internal audits, supplier relationships, dealer service records, and an entire generation of new hires joining the engineering.org without blowing the whistle, or at least without a whistle anyone acted on. Fraud that survives that long usually isn't the work of one guilty engineer. It's the product of a system that made the alternative, telling the truth, feel more dangerous than the fraud itself. So how did it finally break? Not through a regulator's routine desk audit, and not through an internal leak. It broke because a small group of researchers, working with real-world portable emissions testing equipment, literal boxes strapped to the back of a car, not a laboratory, decided to drive Volkswagen diesels on actual American roads and just measure what came out of the tailpipe. This is the detail worth sitting with. The fraud was built to fool a specific, known, standardized lab test. It was never built to fool a spontaneous road trip with a sensor kit in the trunk, because nobody inside Volkswagen expected anyone to bother running that test outside a lab. The whole scheme had a blind spot exactly the size of, what if someone just drives the car normally while measuring it? Regulators caught it in 2015, using that real-world testing equipment strapped to a car for a genuine road trip, not a lab. Once the data didn't match the lab numbers, there was no more room for an innocent explanation. A car that pollutes 40 times over the limit only when nobody's testing it doesn't have a calibration bug. It has an author. Now, here's the part of the story most retellings skip past too quickly, and it's the part that actually matters if you run anything bigger than yourself. How did an entire engineering organization end up choosing fraud over failure? Volkswagen's leadership had set aggressive targets to become the world's largest automaker. And diesel technology was the centerpiece of that push, the thing that was supposed to let them outsell and outclean everyone else at once, in markets that love diesel's fuel economy and torque. That's a strategic bet made at the top of the company, translated down through the org chart into a technical specification that landed on engineers' desks. Hit these emissions numbers, hit this power output, hit this fuel economy, on this timeline, at this cost. Nobody at the top wrote an email saying, "Please commit fraud." That's important, and it's also almost beside the point. Nobody needs to write that email for fraud to become the rational move inside a broken incentive structure. Put yourself in the position of the engineer who runs the numbers and realizes the spec is not achievable with the current technology. What are the actual options in front of you? Option 1. Go up the chain and say the target can't be hit. In a healthy organization, that's just information, and a good leader treats it as a gift. It lets you adjust the plan before you've shipped a broken product, not after. But if the culture around you treats missed targets as a personal failure, if the goal is non-negotiable, is the operating philosophy from the top, then telling the truth doesn't feel like delivering information. It feels like volunteering to be the problem. It feels like putting your name on the reason the company didn't hit its number. Option 2 then quietly becomes, find a way to make the numbers say what they need to say, and hope nobody looks too closely at how you got there. When option 1 feels career-ending and option 2 feels survivable, you don't need a company full of bad people to get a decade of fraud. You just need a company full of ordinary people responding rationally to the incentives in front of them. That's the mechanism worth remembering, because it's not unique to cars or to Volkswagen. It's a pattern. An ambitious target gets set at the top without full information about what's technically achievable. The target becomes symbolic, a promise to investors, a story about market leadership which makes it feel immovable even when the underlying facts change. The people closest to the actual constraint, the engineers who know the real numbers, have no safe channel to push back without looking like they're the ones failing. And so the gap between the target and reality doesn't get closed through negotiation. It gets closed through concealment. There's a useful way to think about why this specific failure mode is so common, and it comes from a very old idea in management research about goal setting. Specific, difficult goals produce better performance than vague ones, right up until the goal becomes detached from what's actually achievable. Push a target past that point, and instead of getting more effort, you start getting more distortion. People don't magically develop new capabilities because a number got harder. They develop new ways of making the number look hit. A sales team facing an impossible quarterly target doesn't usually generate more real revenue out of nowhere. Some of them start pulling deals forward from next quarter, or offering discounts nobody approved just to make the reported figure match the promise. An engineering team facing an impossible emissions spec doesn't invent a new law of chemistry. It finds a way to make the test see something the road never sees. Different industries, same shape of failure. The gap between the promise and the possible gets filled with performance theatre instead of an honest renegotiation. What makes this especially dangerous is that from the outside, and often from a few layers up, the org chart performance theatre and real performance look identical for a long time. Every quarterly report says the target was hit. Every emissions certificate says the car is clean. The people who could catch the gap early are, almost by design, the people with the least power to say so safely. That's the trap. The information about the true state of the world concentrates exactly where the incentive to hide it also concentrates. But here's the part nobody expects, and it's the pivot this whole video has been building toward. The fraud wasn't really a story about diesel engines at all. It was a story about what a company had trained its own people to believe was safe to say out loud. Diesel was just the terrain where that training got tested. It could have been a software shipping deadline, a sales forecast, a safety certification, a construction timeline, any domain where someone senior sets a number as fixed and someone junior discovers the number is wrong. The chemistry changes. The org chart dynamic doesn't. Let's talk about what it cost, because the consequences here weren't abstract. The company paid more than $30 billion in fines, buybacks, and settlements, a number so large it's almost hard to hold in your head, and yet it undersells the damage because it doesn't include the reputational cost of a brand built for decades around German engineering precision suddenly becoming a punchline. Several executives went to prison, which is genuinely rare in corporate fraud cases of this scale. Most of the time, the fines get paid by shareholders, and nobody personally involved in the decision-making faces jail time. Here, some did. The stock lost a third of its value in days, wiping out billions in shareholder wealth almost instantly, long before the full $30 billion bill had even been tallied. The scandal picked up a nickname that's now shorthand for the whole affair. Dieselgate, and the company's chief executive at the time resigned within days of the news breaking, even while denying personal wrongdoing. None of that undid the underlying failure. It just priced it. Here's my honest take on why this case gets taught so much. And it isn't really about the fines or the prison sentences. It's about the mechanism, and specifically about how ordinary the failure looks up close. Nobody sat in a boardroom and voted to poison the air on purpose. What actually happened is duller and scarier. A target got set without checking whether it was physically achievable, and then the target got protected more fiercely than the truth. That's a decision leaders make constantly, usually without noticing they're making it, every time they reward the appearance of hitting a number over an honest account of why it was missed. And that's really the core management lesson, stated as plainly as I can put it. When a target is set as non-negotiable, and the people closest to the problem have no safe way to say it can't be done, some of them will fake the result instead of failing to reach it. That's not a character flaw specific to Volkswagen's engineers. It's closer to a law of organizational physics. Pressure has to go somewhere. If it can't go upward as honest bad news, it goes sideways into concealment. A leader who punishes bad news harder than bad results is quietly training their team to lie not through any single dramatic instruction, but through 1,000 small reactions to the messengers of unwelcome updates. Which project managers get sidelined after flagging a slipping deadline? Which salespeople get praised for hitting a forecast that, on closer inspection, was hit through channel stuffing or corner cutting? Which engineer gets quietly rewarded for a workaround nobody asks too many questions about, versus which one gets a cold reception for saying this isn't going to work as specified? Think about the asymmetry that has to exist for a scheme like this to survive for nearly a decade. Telling the truth had to feel, consistently, more costly than lying and hoping. That asymmetry doesn't build itself overnight, and it doesn't announce itself with a memo. It builds slowly, through years of which behaviors get rewarded and which ones get punished, until eventually the safest thing an employee can do with bad news is make it disappear instead of reporting it. By the time a scandal like this becomes public, the culture that produced it has usually been running for years. Invisible to the people at the very top, precisely because the whole point of the culture is that bad news doesn't reach the very top. Picture the version of this story where it goes differently, because that version is actually more instructive than the one that happened. An engineer runs the numbers, sees the emissions spec can't be met alongside the power and efficiency targets, and takes that finding to a manager. The manager doesn't treat it as a failure to be buried, treats it as the most valuable piece of information the program has produced all quarter, because it arrived before the cars shipped instead of after. Maybe the company delays the launch. Maybe it drops one corner of the triangle and markets the car honestly as powerful and efficient, with emissions control hardware that adds cost but keeps the numbers real. Maybe it just tells investors the aggressive timeline needs to slip by a year. None of those outcomes are as flattering as we hit every target on schedule. All of them are dramatically cheaper than $30 billion, a criminal investigation, and a brand that still hasn't fully recovered its reputation for trustworthiness. The honest version of this story is boring. That's exactly why it's worth building a culture that can tolerate boring, unwelcome news, because the alternative isn't no news, it's the same news arriving years later with a much larger bill attached. This is also why the lesson generalizes so cleanly beyond the auto industry, and it's worth being explicit about that instead of leaving it implied. Any organization that rewards the appearance of hitting a number more than an honest account of the real number is running the same experiment Volkswagen ran, just with different chemistry and a different regulator. A hospital system that punishes staff for reporting errors will get fewer reported errors and the same number of actual errors, just hidden ones. A software team told a ship date is fixed no matter what will ship on time with the bugs quietly deferred instead of fixed. None of those managers are trying to recreate Dieselgate. They're just running the same incentive structure and getting the same category of outcome because the incentive structure, not the industry, is what produces the behavior. So if you run a team, or you're about to, the actionable version of this lesson isn't "don't commit fraud," that's obvious, and it isn't the risk that actually gets you. The real risk is quieter. It's whether the people who report to you believe, specifically, that they can walk into your office and say, "The number we promised is not achievable," and leave that conversation with their job, their reputation, and your respect intact. If they don't believe that, you won't find out your target was wrong. You'll find out your team got creative instead. And creativity aimed at hiding a problem, rather than solving it, is exactly how a company ends up quietly programming 11 million cars to cheat for the better part of a decade, without a single person in the room ever deciding, out loud, that this was the plan. That's the actual takeaway from Dieselgate. Not diesel, not defeat devices. The lesson is about what happens the moment a number stops being negotiable and the truth stops being safe to say. Every organization has that moment somewhere in it right now, a target getting protected harder than the facts underneath it. The only question is whether anyone with the authority to change it ever finds out before it costs $30 billion to fix. If that changed how you see your team, follow for more.